get this? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find that? Would you kindly find? Would you kindly get this? Would you kindly head to Ryan?
Every once in a while, a piece of art will come across your path in life that will, unbeknownst to you at the time, that will rock your world. One that will enter your subconsciousness and speak to you on a personal level, as if it were holding your hand and guiding your emotions through a mental street polluted with traffic of thoughts and feelings. Sometimes it will get you through tough times. Sometimes that experience will shape you, and yet even rarer than that, that piece of art will stick with you for the rest of your life. When you come across one of those diamonds in the rough, it will become a part of you in one way or another. As I've gotten older, I've often debated what my favorite game of all time is, and it really comes down to a couple of criteria. Am I classifying it in terms of the game being strictly fun? Am I classifying it in terms of how many times I can beat the game without getting bored of it? Am I classifying it in terms of what impact the game has had on me? When I was 13, I played Silent Hill 2, and in all intents and purposes, my outlook on life was never the same. And now that Silent Hill 2 is 20 years old, and that I have some actual editing and script writing skills under my belt, I feel like I can finally talk about this. There have been more than enough videos talking about Silent Hill 2, from a deep analysis to a casual review, and I don't want to become just another one of those. So I figured that the only way I can really make this video feel like my own is by doing just that. Making it my own. This is what Silent Hill 2 means to me. If you've seen my channel before, then you know that I've talked about how I've been playing video games for pretty much my entire life, for better or worse. When you are as young as I was playing games, regardless of the narrative focus of the game, you get enraptured by the world just existing. Playing a video game at that age is something that you just feel. When I was really young, I was completely emotionally invested with an old game called Treasure Mountain, where the controls were hot garbage, laggy as hell. The gameplay was pretty bare bones, but just exploring and finding clues that you needed to make it to the top of the mountain was captivating. As I got a bit older and ventured into the realm of the Super Nintendo, the games that I had on my system at the time were ones that were never really depthful in terms of story. At least the ones that I played. I had Final Fantasy VI, yes, but god damn it to hell if my 6-year-old brain was ever gonna sit through that. The games that I had growing up were games like Kirby Superstar, Yoshi's Island, Donkey Kong Country, Mario Kart, Contra, Castlevania 4, Mario Paint, and even some bad ones like Bart's Nightmare and some Darkwing Duck game, but we won't talk about those. My point is, for that a long while, games were just fun things to be lost in. I would often find myself just imagining what lied beyond the horizon line and stare endlessly into the backgrounds, picturing heat of lava or cold snow brushing against my skin, and I would soak in the game's varying levels of atmosphere. Games in this era of my life, or at least the ones that I played specifically, may have had stories, like Super Metroid for example, but the story of games around this era would always put the gaming mechanics of the game over all else. You played a game for fun mechanics and engaging gameplay. When I was growing up, I got excited for upcoming games because I would sit in my room reading the synopsis of magazine articles and imagining the mechanics of the game. How would they play? How immersive would the game be? How nice were the graphics? none of which were related to the game's narrative, as you may have noticed. I would usually skip the game's cutscenes as I really didn't care why I had to save the world another time, or find the MacGuffin, because in the end of those games, it never really mattered. Who cared? I just wanted to play the game. Coming back to Super Metroid, for example, the story is only ever discussed and enforced at the very beginning of the game. And even then, the story is pretty bare bones. The game does have a lot of thematic connections that tie into the gameplay, but a lot of the story is pretty much abandoned after the initial space station run. The only part of the entire story that matters throughout the game is...
Hey yo, the Metroid's gone, go get it!
The entire rest of the game is you exploring a desolate planet. Soft, melodic, ambient music drives your emotions as your exploration of the planet Zebes continues to burrow you further and deeper into the planet's core. The gameplay loop of Super Metroid is just so rewarding as you discover items that allow you to access new areas, and you feel as if you and Samus are getting stronger together. It spawned a genre in and of itself, and Samus's journey is one that has stuck with me far beyond pretty much any game in existence. I beat it when I was roughly 7 years old with the help of my mom's strategy guide that I unfortunately can't seem to find. I still feel bad about ripping the page in the book that covers the part of the Meridia level. I can still see the tape binding the torn pages together. But I start with Super Metroid in my video about Silent Hill 2, as ridiculous as that might sound, because it is the earliest gaming memory in which the atmosphere and places beyond the gaming spaces were not ones that I had to imagine. Controlling Samus on her quest was one that enveloped both me and her with the same emotion. We were both tied to the same isolation, the same intensity, and the same awe of the world around her. Super Metroid is and always will be my first ever favorite game. It introduced me to atmosphere as a key component of immersion in games. I've talked about this before, but gaming stands out among other art forms in terms of atmospheric immersion due to the simple fact that you are able to control the art itself. Holding that controller makes you and the protagonist one in the same. Movies, at most, can only make you relate to the character. You may see yourself within them, understand their reasoning, their actions, their plights, their desires, their fears, and their wants. But by simply controlling the character in a video game, all barriers between you and the person on the screen essentially dissipate. You no longer just understand them and just relate to them, but you feel all of it. You become that character that is essentially now a tulpa for you to inhabit them. And Super Metroid was the first time that I felt an emotional connection to a game that transcended beyond the game just being, quote-unquote, fun. A lot of Super Metroid is difficult. It can be obtuse, and the world is huge. It's easy to get lost, and it's often hard to remember where you have to go, even as someone who has beaten it upwards of 10 to 15 times. Super Metroid is incredibly special to me, and I go out of my way to not play it as often as I could because I might ruin the magic that the game has. I am not this kid, but on Christmas 1996, I might as well have been. I freaked out nearly as much as he did, but the only difference was that my parents weren't recording it. I was given a few select games on this day. Ones that stand out to me in my memory are Shadows of the Empire, which, if I recall correctly, was the first game I booted up on the N64. I still remember the big sprawling logo slapping itself on the title screen and my mom turning to my dad in a flabbergasted manner going, "Wow, look at this. Some others were some random Lamborghini racing game that was for my dad, but he never played. And Mischief Makers, which is a game that I need to revisit one day. During the first years of owning the console, I was again wowed and enraptured by the graphics and mechanics that were being presented on this new 3D console. It was like finally breaking through a barrier that I didn't even know was there. Looking back at it in hindsight, it's kinda crazy to think at one point I thought games couldn't look better than this, or that GoldenEye was as good as first-person shooters could ever get. But at the time, that was reality. The stories of all of these games were yet again tossed to the side in my mind. Games like Shadows of the Empire that had a clear-cut story going on were still cast aside. I couldn't tell you what was going on even by the time I reached the ending of the game. I did whatever I could to skip, avoid, ignore any of the narrative because at that age of my life, I just wanted to shoot dudes and watch them fall off the side of cliffs. The N64 era was, and even more so in retrospect, is very awkward. Even more so now than then, it is so clear that the entire generation of consoles was essentially a mulligan in terms of technology, game design, and overall use of 3D space in video games. 3D was such a radically new thing for developers that the standards that we now have weren't officially really set into place until like 2009 to 2012. That's a long fucking time. But one game that I played during the N64 lifespan was one that truly stood out to me as something else. A monster of a game that began to reshape what a video game was and could be. And it all started with a name entry. I'm not sure that I can really explain to you what playing through Ocarina of Time was like when the game was new. I had never really seen anything quite like it. I had played A Link to the Past before, sure, but I never had the fortitude to play through it until I was much older. Ocarina was something different. One of the most important things looking back on Ocarina of Time and my growing up with it is that skipping cutscenes was forbidden. I realize now that in hindsight, that was probably the best decision that they could have done for a younger demographic. Even during my first run of the game, I complained that I couldn't skip the story beats at the beginning, but because it forced my rambunctious mind to pay attention to the story, I distinctly remembered that when I listened to Sheik speak to me in the Temple of Time after finally becoming an adult, that I felt the gravity of the game's story and the weight of the world on my shoulders. Everyone was counting on me. As I progressed through each temple from then on, I could feel the destructive nature of what Ganondorf had brought upon the world of Hyrule. Ocarina was the first game that I had ever played that had theming, that had an emotional impact on me from the story itself. Going from childhood where everything seemed peaceful, serene, elegant, and lively, into adulthood where everything is broken and truly horrific went over my head as a kid. I didn't realize that the truth of life was staring me in the face as I enjoyably slashed at all of the monsters with an effervescent glee. As the game progressed and I saved more and more of the sages, I realized that everyone in Link's life as a youth was essentially being robbed from him. I soon felt the same sadness that Link was probably feeling because he and I were the same. By the end of the game where you traverse Ganondorf's tower, I fully embodied Link and his quest. Ocarina of Time was the first time that a game had made me feel like the story of a video game mattered. I felt the impending doom of Ganondorf and his relentless hunger for power. I knew that I was the only person in Hyrule that could stop it, and I could imagine the horror that would befall the world around us if I wasn't able to succeed in our quest, and it was the first time that any game made me truly feel triumphant. I felt it all.
There are only 3 STARS members left now. Captain Wesker, Jill, and myself. We don't know where Barry is.
Now, as I do have an entire video talking about my introduction to Resident Evil, specifically the remake, which I will link here, I will keep this section relatively brief. I had grown up with adventure games like Myst and the Monkey Island series, and that sense of atmosphere and immersion had been something that was hard to replicate and find in the era of the N64. As the years passed on, and the connection that I had with ambience in video games that had been so entwined with Super Metroid steadily grew to be less and less important to me. But when my uncle had told me that he had a copy of a game that was supposed to be a game that was meant to scare you, I couldn't get my mind off of it. Upon actually getting my hands on the Resident Evil remake on the GameCube years later, I was stunned to find myself in a complete obsession with the franchise. From summer leading into 8th grade until about the summer leading into high school, Resident Evil was the only thing I could think about. The emphasis on puzzles and slow burn action unlocked some sort of need for atmosphere back in video games. The slow unfolding of the Spencer Mansion made me feel like I was unraveling a mystery, and because of my young mind, I was even blown away by the reveal of Wesker being a bad guy. This guy.
Wearing sunglasses indoors at night.
Resident Evil was the stepping stone onto a path of horror games that I still am on track with today. Its mechanics worked so in sync that the remake is still one of the best games I have ever played. The puzzle box structure is one that I believe to be a linchpin style of the survival horror genre. The genre exists outside of the structure, of course, and you obviously don't need fixed cameras to classify as a survival horror. But I think Resident Evil, specifically the GameCube remake, stands head and shoulders above the genre, as it is a perfect blend of being an enjoyable game in terms of mechanics, in terms of graphics, and in terms of being tense in an actual horror game. While I stand that the original games up until Resident Evil 7 weren't actually scary, I do acknowledge that the atmosphere and the mechanics were all geared towards making the player feel helpless and therefore succeeds at being a horror game. The Resident Evil remake represented a crossroad where I discovered an entire new type of game and rediscovered that atmosphere could be a key component of what made a game engaging.
I got a letter. The name on the envelope said Mary.
Yes, we're finally going to talk about this. I hadn't been fully aware of the Silent Hill series until I had beaten the Resident Evil remake. But once I had become aware of it, I had focused my new ADHD-riddled obsession-focused brain over to it, because even though the Resident Evil games had been incredibly fun and enjoyable experiences, I had never been scared by them. The enticing possibility that Silent Hill could finally be the game that genuinely scared me was too much for me to resist. It took about a month or so for me deciding that I wanted to play the game to actually getting a copy of Silent Hill 2 in my hands. The craziest thing about the lead up to me getting that game is that I somehow did not spoil myself for the story. I still remember the website, SilentHillHeaven.com, which is unfortunately just a forum website now, but at the time it was the premier website that I used to find out information about the game. I spent hours in my free time looking up all kinds of things about the areas of the town, the enemies, and a lot about the weapons and items. The most shocking thing looking back on all of it is that I was never given a hint or credence to the fact that a lot of the enemies had symbolic purposes. As far as I could tell, and gleaned from the information that I was reading, the enemies of Silent Hill were just some supernatural placement, or it even could have just been a real situation a la the Umbrella Corporation from Resident Evil. But from the very first seconds of Silent Hill 2, I could tell that something was different about this game. The things I had learned mostly boiled down to the gameplay mechanics and not so much the actual atmosphere of the game. And I think that next to the story, that is what stuck out to me the most about Silent Hill 2 on my first playthrough, and even still up to this day. There is an overall sadness to Silent Hill 2, one that no other game in the franchise comes close to matching. The fog that started as a technical limitation transcends into a mood all on its own. completely enveloping James Sunderland and the player entwined as they both explore an abandoned town. James is empty and broken inside. His wife suffered from a disease 3 years ago and passed away due to complications from it, and for 3 long years, James has been suffering under the burden of his wife's death. Throughout the game, he admits to drinking to distill the pain to a tolerable level and probably hasn't had a day of sunlight in those 3 long years. But James as a main character hides behind the disguise of the format of a narrative. As you start the game, James is completely relatable, a protagonist with an emotionally relatable and noble mission. When I played through Silent Hill 2 for the first time, I was completely on James's side. I soon began to hold out hope that Mary really was waiting for me. And as I continued to push my way through Silent Hill, I began to meet characters that, unbeknownst to me at the time, were echoes of not only James, but themes of the game itself. I grew to trust James. I empathized with his plight. As we explored the abandoned buildings together, the hollow emptiness of the game's corridors enveloped us and brought about this feeling of malevolence that I can't quite explain. Finding scattered notes throughout the hospitals and the nightmare versions of the town that slowly begin speaking specifically to James himself unearthed a feeling of unease that no game had ever made me feel before. To an extent, the fourth wall was being broken, and I wasn't sure how I should be reacting to something like that. At some point, I was worried that the game was going to mention me by name. It was like a twisted alternate reality of adventure games that I had played before in my youth. Characters you meet through the story come and go. Some break under the weight of the town's power, some don't. But all of the stories are tragic in one way or another. No game prior had painted the picture of trauma so clearly, or really at all up until that point in my life. And being presented under the guise of a video game somehow made it relatable and understandable to me. And besides, James was someone that I could trust. That much I was certain. However, clues laid throughout the town paint a darker portrait of not only the people that you meet, but James himself as well. I think the first instance where you question James as a reliable narrator is the first conversation that you have with Laura outside of the apartments. For the first time, I had experienced a confounding crossway in terms of my connection with video games. I had a reason to doubt my digital conduit. Unable to truly process the possibility of anything other than truth from a protagonist, I reacted harshly to Laura's accusation and grew more attached to James as a character. We were on the same quest. I wanted James to find Mary, because that was what it was expected of me in the story of a video game. Find the girl, complete the quest, conclude the objective, beat the game. That's what I understood of video game stories at that point. I was supposed to conquer the town and be the hero. But Silent Hill 2 isn't like most games. At the time, you'd be hard-pressed to find a game that was anything like Silent Hill 2 in its story or its presentation. Silent Hill 2 is about so much. None of it very positive. Silent Hill 2 is about regret, guilt, pain, trauma, remorse, grief, sexual assault, murder, the dichotomy of a killer, punishment, and so much more. James betrays you. And when I realized this bombshell twist late into the game, I stood dumbfounded, looking at my screen, my mind so completely thrust out of my skull that I was unable to even make a sound. And maybe by design, or because my stupid brain can't deal with coping with a lot of scrupulative emotions, I only attach myself to James more. In a strange attempt to what I can only assume to prevent myself from feeling betrayed by someone that I had been playing as for so long. And when the credits rolled on Silent Hill 2 for the first time, I set the controller down and just stared at the screen and then head in hands. For the first time ever, a video game had truly emotionally touched me on a profound level. Me being the curious type, I immediately began doing searches online for whatever I could find on it. I wanted to know more of what was going on, And to my surprise, and to a personal revelation, I discovered that so much of the game was symbolic and layered deep within metaphors. Silent Hill 2 quickly enveloped my imagination unlike anything ever really had. I had become obsessed with all of what the images could relate to. The monsters in the game meant something. They weren't just creepy monsters designed to be as spooky as possible. Each thing in the game was contributing to the game's themes. The story of the game and the backdrop it had hidden from me hit me so hard that to this day, Silent Hill 2 is a game that I still think about on a nearly daily basis. I've concocted theories, I've watched hundreds of videos, read hundreds of interviews, listened to podcasts, listened to music, everything under the sun regarding this game. But as I've gotten older, there has been a deeper connection on a much more personal level with Silent Hill 2.
It doesn't matter who I am. I'm here for you, James. See? I'm real.
When I look back on Silent Hill 2 now and what it means to me, I think of points in my life when I couldn't speak to anyone, when the emotions of dealing with, depression were at my strongest. To anyone who is related to this game on remotely the same level that I have, it's probably safe to say that Silent Hill 2 has become your depression game. And it's weird to say that for a piece of horror media, but as I've explored the avenues of horror, it's actually a feeling that I come to a lot of the time in the genre. When horror is done at a slow burn pace, when atmosphere becomes first and foremost, it's like the inner feelings and emotion that relate to depression are manifested onto the screen itself. And Silent Hill 2, I think, for a lot of us, is unironically the Silent Hill that we experience at points in our lives. When I was really struggling in my 20s in general, pretty much all my 20s, I felt as though through external forces or catastrophizing in my own head that I didn't truly deserve the life that I was given, and simultaneously that I would be better off dead. At the time, I was in a long-distance relationship with someone across the country, and while things were fine for a little while, it quickly fell apart as fast as it sorta happened. And for what seemed like forever, I was emotionally destroyed. I delivered pizzas at the time, and I would listen to the soundtrack of Silent Hill 2 on repeat for what seemed like months on end. I seriously probably have at least 2,000 full listens of the soundtrack clocked in my lifetime. During my drives in the cold California valley air, I would think back on things that I had done, and I would crave this overwhelming need for punishment. Nothing I could do would absolve me of my regrets, of the circumstances, and nothing could stop me from feeling awful and helpless all of the time. The way that I coped with these feelings was a fleeting, tiny, minuscule hope that I could go through some horrific circumstances and essentially cleanse myself of the guilt and regret that had befallen me. Just like James had gone through his journey, I wanted some sort of guaranteed emotional salvation at nearly any cost. The music within the soundtrack of Silent Hill 2 was one that perfectly encapsulated the emotional turmoil of the themes of the game. The music at a certain level felt like a transcendental experience. Like the composer of the game's music, Akira Yamaoka, had opened a window into my own heart and soul through the soundtrack, and those car rides, window open, cold wind blaring on my face while I pushed 80 on the freeway with some hot Zaz in the passenger seat, are and forever will be ingrained in my memory of darker times, but ones in which that I began to understand how to process some serious negative emotions. Silent Hill at this point in my life is not only synonymous with horror, but with isolation and a strange sense of prolific meditative reflection. The derelict streets, coated in blood and riddled with riddles and fog, have honestly never left me. I still suffer from anxiety, and I still suffer from depression. I'm doing relatively alright at the moment, thanks for asking. And often, when I am in my darkest points, I still retreat in my mind to the streets of Silent Hill, because the town and all of its malevolence and tendencies to bring out the darkest points of a person out into the light, I still find a comfort in the fact that one can go to Silent Hill and conquer themselves within its horrific streets. I always found the concept of the void that you stare into being one to be tangible and one of your own self to be haunting but beautiful. I think partly that the nature that Silent Hill 2 presented the town to be is a broken place for broken people. When I feel broken, I return to the solace of reassurance from a similarly broken place, no matter how haunting it may be. I believe that the reason sad people often find comfort in sad media is partly due to the stigma surrounding mental health. A lot of people suffering from depression feel even more isolated than they probably should be feeling because they feel as if they can't truly express how they feel to others, and fear that if they do, they will be looked down upon by their peers. When someone like that feels those specific feelings, I think that when they find a sad song, or sad movie, or sad book, or a sad game, then they find solace, because they can express their feelings silently and tie it with that media. They feel a comfort knowing that the thing they're connecting with understands them. They relate to it, and it feels, if only for a moment, as if things will be okay, because they are expressing themselves. And even better yet, the connection is an intangible, invisible entwinement. Silent Hill 2 opened my eyes to art as I see it now. It single-handedly reshaped the way that I look at video games, the way that I interpret art, and the patience that I have with the relationship of art itself. No game, no album, no movie, no book, nothing has touched me the way that the inner journey of James Sunderland and his tragic quest to find his wife has. And just like Resident Evil before, I'm not truly sure if I can put into words what the game has done to me. But I thank the team for making it. I wouldn't be here without it.
Tomato is a fruit, but it's also a vegetable.